I was bucking up a fir that had come down across an old skid road when the saw hit something in the duff at the base of the stump, and before I even registered what was happening, the ground itself seemed to come alive. Not the tree, the ground. A cloud came up out of the dirt like the earth had opened, and I heard the pitch of the buzzing change before I even had time to think the word yellowjacket. A sound that went from background noise to something urgent in less than a second. I'd cut straight into the roof of a yellowjacket nest I never saw coming. Nothing on the surface giving away that anything was down there at all. And I was moving before my brain had finished processing why. That's the moment this video comes from. And it's exactly the kind of thing that happens to people working in the woods a lot more often than anybody talks about. Quietly, without much fanfare. Until it's your turn. Let's get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe because I get into this kind of real, tested outdoor knowledge pretty regularly. Loggers deal with stinging insects more than almost anybody else working outdoors. And it's not bad luck. It's the nature of the job itself. A predictable hazard that comes standard with the kind of ground you're constantly working through. Ground nesting yellowjackets build directly in soil, old rodent burrows, hollow stumps, the base of rotting logs. Exactly the kind of terrain you're constantly working through with a saw or a brush cutter. Terrain that never announces what's underneath it until you're already committed to a cut. No visible warning sign anywhere on the surface most of the time. And here's the part that actually connects the job to the danger. Vibration is one of the biggest triggers for a defensive swarm. More reliable at setting one off than almost anything else you could do short of direct contact. A running chainsaw, a brush cutter, even heavy footfalls near a nest read to the colony as an attack. The same kind of signal a predator digging toward them would send. An ancient defensive instinct that has no way of distinguishing between a badger after their larvae and a guy just trying to buck up firewood. The response coded in long before anything with a chainsaw ever existed to trigger it, by accident. You don't have to step on the nest to set it off. You just have to be close enough, running loud enough equipment, and the whole colony can boil up out of the ground in seconds. No direct contact required at all. The size of what you're dealing with is bigger than most people picture too. What you see on the surface, that one small hole, is nowhere close to the whole story. Just the visible tip of something much larger built underground where nobody can see it coming. Underground, a mature nest can be the size of a basketball or larger, holding anywhere from a few hundred workers early in the season up to several thousand by the time you get into late summer. An entire hidden city expanding all season long right under a piece of ground that looks like nothing special from the surface. No different in appearance from any other patch of dirt you'd walk right over without a second thought. And unlike honeybees, which sting once and die because their stinger stays behind, yellowjackets can sting repeatedly, over and over, as many times as they want, which is exactly what makes disturbing a nest so much more dangerous than a single insect encounter. Since there's no built-in limit on how many times any one worker can come back at you, no natural ceiling on the damage a single angry insect can do before it gives up or runs out of venom. Timing matters more than most people realize too. Colonies start small in spring. Just a queen and a handful of workers. Genuinely not much of a threat if you happen to stumble across one early in the season while it's still just getting established. Easy enough to walk away from without incident if you notice it at all at that stage. By late summer and into fall, that same nest has grown into a colony of hundreds or thousands. And the insects themselves get noticeably more aggressive as the season winds down. The colony sensing its own collapse coming with the cold and defending what's left of it harder than it did all summer. Throwing everything they've got into protecting a nest that's already living on borrowed time either way. A last defensive push before the whole thing dies off, regardless of anything you do or don't do. If you're doing brush clearing or firewood work anytime from August through the first real frost, you're working during exactly the window when a ground nest is at its biggest and it's most likely to come out swinging. Which is unfortunately also exactly when a lot of firewood processing and end-of-season cleanup naturally tends to happen. The the two calendars lining up in about the worst possible way. Here's the old logger's way of dealing with this, and it starts before you ever pick up a saw, which is honestly the whole trick. Most of the danger here happens before the actual cutting ever begins, if you're paying attention. Before you cut into a stump, a hollow log, or start clearing brush in an area you haven't worked before, stop and actually look and listen for a few seconds, resisting the urge to just get on with the job the way most of us default to when there's a full day of work ahead. Watch for insects flying in and out of a single small hole in the ground in a steady, purposeful traffic pattern, not just wandering bugs, but a clear in-and-out rhythm that looks almost like a tiny airport with planes lining up to land and take off. Distinct enough once you know to look for it that it's hard to mistake for anything else once you've actually seen it a time or two. Listen for a low hum coming from inside a stump or a downed log before you ever put a blade to it. A sound that's genuinely distinct once you've heard it a time or two. Somewhere between a purr and a buzz that doesn't belong to wind or insects just passing through. A steady undertone that gives itself away the moment you actually stop the saw and hold still long enough to notice it. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but that 10 seconds of paying attention before you commit to a cut is the single biggest thing separating a normal workday from the kind of afternoon I had with that first stump. Comment down below if you've ever cut into a hidden nest yourself, because I want to know how many of you have your own version of that moment where the ground came alive underneath a saw or a mower. If you do disturb one, what you do in the next 10 seconds matters more than almost anything else, and it goes directly against what most people's instincts are screaming at them to do in the moment. Do not swat. I know that's the instinct. Somebody's on you. You want to fight back. Every nerve in your body telling you to defend yourself the way you would against anything else attacking you. A completely reasonable reaction to have, and exactly the wrong one to actually follow through on. But swatting or killing a yellowjacket releases an alarm pheromone that signals the rest of the colony exactly where the threat is, and rallies more of them to the same spot. A chemical broadcast that spreads through the whole nest faster than you'd think possible for something you can't see or smell yourself. You're not defending yourself when you swat. You're painting a target and ringing a dinner bell for the rest of the nest, turning one angry insect into a whole colony's worth of reinforcements converging on your exact location, every one of them arriving already primed to attack the second they get there. The actual move is to run in a straight line away from the nest as fast as you can go, covering your face and neck with your arm or whatever you've got on hand, since that's where they tend to target first. Going for the exposed skin that's easiest to reach and hardest for you to protect, while you're already moving at a dead sprint, with your attention split between running and not tripping over anything in your path. Yellowjackets generally won't chase much past 50 to 100 feet from their nest, which sounds like a short distance when you're standing still reading this, but is about the length of a mature tree lying on the ground, plenty far enough to get clear if you commit to it immediately instead of hesitating, second-guessing, or stopping to look back and see how bad it actually is, which only costs you time you don't have to spare in that moment. I want to clear up a couple of pieces of folklore while we're at it, because some of what gets repeated as common knowledge here is actually wrong, or at least badly oversimplified. And I'd rather you have the accurate version instead of the campfire version everybody's heard a dozen times. Jumping into water to escape a swarm doesn't work the way people think it does. Yellowjackets will hover and wait for you to surface, patient in a way that genuinely surprises people who assume the water itself is some kind of magic barrier, treating the whole pond like a lid they just need to wait out rather than an actual escape. And you'll get stung the second you come up for air. So a pond or a creek is not the safe haven it feels like it should be in the moment, no matter how tempting it looks when you're being chased and every instinct is telling you to just get underwater and disappear. And the advice about clothing color is more complicated than most people realize, because it actually depends on which insect you're dealing with. And most of the advice floating around online just picks one answer and repeats it as if it applies universally. Yellowjackets and wasps get drawn in by bright colors and floral patterns, since those visually mimic the flowers they forage on for food, meaning a bright shirt reads to them as a potential meal, not a threat. A case of mistaken identity working entirely in the insect's favor and against yours. Honeybees are a different story entirely. They're documented to target dark colors specifically, because dark, fuzzy shapes read to a honeybee as a bear or another natural predator, an instinct baked in from generations of actual predators raiding hives for honey. An old evolutionary memory that has nothing to do with flowers at all, wired into the species long before anybody was walking around in a plain dark work shirt with no interest in their hive whatsoever. So the honest answer isn't just wear light colors and you're covered. It's wear plain, solid colors. Nothing bright or floral, nothing dark and fuzzy either. And you've hedged against both categories of insect instead of just one, covering the actual range of what you might run into out in the woods on any given day. Now let's talk about why this actually matters beyond just the pain of a sting. Because I think a lot of people underestimate how serious multiple stings can get even without any allergy involved. Treating the whole thing as a temporary annoyance instead of the genuine medical event it can turn into. Wasp venom on its own is nowhere near as concentrated as bee venom per sting, but where wasps make up for that is volume. Since a single insect can sting you dozens of times in the same encounter if you don't get clear fast, unlike a bee that's spent after one shot. Somewhere in the range of 50 to 500 stings is considered enough raw venom to be lethal on toxicity alone. A number worth sitting with for a second, given how many stings a genuinely angry ground nest can deliver in under a minute. Direct systemic poisoning with no allergic reaction required at all, affecting the kidneys, the muscles, the blood. Organs that have nothing to do with a typical allergic response and everything to do with the sheer volume of toxin working its way through your system all at once. The body simply overwhelmed by raw chemistry rather than reacting to it the way it would to a substance it's specifically primed against. A disturbed ground nest with thousands of workers is genuinely capable of delivering that many stings to somebody who doesn't get away fast. Which is part of why running immediately matters so much more than most people initially assume it does. And why those first few seconds of hesitation cost more than they seem to in the moment. Then there's the separate risk of anaphylaxis, which doesn't follow the same math at all and operates on a completely different logic than raw toxicity does. About 1% of people carry a genuine allergy to this venom, and for that group, a single sting can be enough to trigger a life-threatening reaction, no volume required whatsoever. The immune system itself becoming the actual danger rather than the venom's raw chemistry. What makes this trickier is that sensitivity isn't necessarily something you're born with and stuck with forever, one way or the other for your whole life. It can develop over years of repeated exposure, which puts outdoor workers, loggers, beekeepers, anybody who spends a career around these insects at higher long-term risk than somebody who only encounters them occasionally on a weekend hike. The exposure itself slowly building toward a threshold nobody can see coming until it's crossed. Invisible right up until the exact moment it isn't anymore. If you've had a bad reaction before, even one that felt mild at the time, swelling that spread well beyond the sting site, difficulty breathing, dizziness, that's worth a real conversation with a doctor about carrying an epinephrine autoinjector, because the next reaction in that pattern tends to be worse, not better. And it's not something you want to be figuring out for the first time 30 minutes from the nearest hospital with no plan and no gear on hand. Trying to remember basic first aid while your own throat's starting to feel tight. That risk of developing sensitivity over a working lifetime is part of why I don't think of this the same way I did 20 years ago, back when getting stung a few times a season felt like just part of the job and nothing worth thinking twice about. The kind of thing you'd mention in passing and move right on from without a second thought. I've watched guys I worked with go from shrugging off stings for years to having a genuinely scary reaction seemingly out of nowhere. The kind of thing that stops a whole crew cold and makes everybody suddenly a lot more careful for the rest of that season at least. And it wasn't out of nowhere at all. It was just the accumulated exposure finally catching up with a body that had been quietly building sensitivity the whole time without announcing it. No warning shot fired before the real thing hit. Nothing gradual enough to notice until the day it wasn't gradual at all anymore. I don't think that means panic every time you see a yellowjacket. Treating every encounter like a 5-alarm emergency that requires dropping everything and calling it a day, which would make the job impossible to actually get done most seasons. I think it means paying attention to how your own body's reacting over the years instead of just assuming your history so far predicts your future the same way it always has. Since that exact assumption is what catches people off guard the one time it finally doesn't hold. Practically speaking, this changes a few small habits more than it changes the whole job. Nothing dramatic. Just a handful of small adjustments layered onto how I already worked. I check stumps and hollow logs before I commit a saw to them now. Every time. Not just when something feels off. Treating it as a standard step instead of an occasional precaution I only remember after something's already gone wrong. The same way I'd never skip checking a chain's tension just because it looked fine yesterday. I've gotten more deliberate about brush clearing timing, saving the thickest ground level work for spring when colonies are still small if I've got any flexibility in the schedule. And staying extra alert come August when I know the odds have shifted against me. Treating that shift in season as a real change in risk instead of just a calendar date that doesn't actually mean anything. I keep a sting relief kit in the truck. Basic stuff. Nothing fancy. Just enough to take the edge off a normal encounter that doesn't need a hospital visit. And if anybody on a job has a known allergy, I make sure I know exactly where their auto-injector is before we ever start cutting. Not after somebody's already in trouble and everybody's scrambling to remember where they packed it. Digging through a truck bed while precious minutes tick by and the person who needs it can barely tell you where to look anymore. Comment down below what your own worst sting story looks like. Because I have a feeling this comment section is going to turn into a pretty entertaining collection of people's own versions of that moment. The ground came alive on them too. Everybody's got at least one story like this if they've spent enough time working outdoors. My grandfather dealt with plenty of nests over his working life, the same way most old loggers did. Mostly through the same kind of quiet, practical awareness I've been describing, rather than any special gear or technique nobody else had access to. Nothing you couldn't have picked up just from watching him work for a season or two. He didn't have a name for alarm pheromones or a study on venom toxicity thresholds. Wouldn't have known the actual chemistry behind any of it if you'd asked him directly. He just knew. The way people who spend enough years in the woods tend to know things. That you listen before you cut. You run instead of fight. And you respect a hole in the ground you can't see the bottom of. Rules that came from experience rather than any book or class. The kind of knowledge that only ever gets taught by watching somebody else do it right. Or wrong. Enough times to notice the pattern. That's really the whole old logger's way in a sentence, not some secret trick. Just paying attention to signals most people walk right past and taking the couple of seconds it costs to actually look and listen before committing to a cut. The same unglamorous habit that saved more people than any piece of specialized gear ever could. No product to buy, nothing to strap on. Just the discipline to stop and check before you commit. I'll put together a proper sting kit breakdown for anybody who wants specifics on what to actually carry for a day of brushwork or firewood processing. Since that's a slightly different conversation than just avoidance, and there's a real difference between what you need in your truck versus what you need on your actual person while you're cutting. Two separate kits solving two separate problems. For now, if you're heading out to clear brush or buck up firewood this season, take those 10 seconds before you cut into anything you can't see clearly into first. It's the cheapest insurance you'll ever buy against an afternoon that goes sideways as fast as mine did, and it costs you nothing but a few seconds of patience you were probably going to spend catching your breath anyway, before starting the next cut, regardless. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.